Are you enjoying the story so far? I dropped my pen.
I hope you are.
We are kicking off week 3 this week, moving into chapter number 3 of the story. And where that brings us, in case you're wondering or haven't necessarily been keeping track, is chapter 3 of the story begins at about Genesis 37. So if you've been keeping up on your reading, you've moved through the majority of Genesis at this point, as well as, and you may not have noticed, there was a couple passages from Hebrews included as well, where they fit chronologically. And so this week, as we move into chapter 3 of the story, we can look back and see that in chapter 1, week 1, we learned that Adam and Eve were created to have a perfect relationship with one another and a perfect relationship with God. But they chose different. God in His love gives us a choice, and they chose something different. They chose to be disobedient to God, forever damaging that relationship that humankind can have with Him. And so we see that as we're moving into the story, we begin to see God reaching out to humanity to restore that relationship. And last week we looked at the story of Abram and Sarai, later Abraham and Sarah, as God was choosing to develop or build a new nation out of them as part of His plan to reach humanity. He was building this nation of His chosen people, eventually the nation of Israel, with the thought in mind that ideally these people, if they would be obedient to Him, if they would choose differently than what Adam and Eve had chosen, would bear witness to the reality of God for the entire world, to look upon them and see what life with God looks like and what it brings. And so we see that as God began to establish this nation, He chose the most unlikely couple in Abraham and Sarah, an elderly couple without children, to build a nation. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But God, in His goodness and His mercy and His wisdom, blessed them with a child at an age that would cause humanity forever to look upon that and say, that was God. That wasn't Abraham and Sarah. That was God that did that. And that child that they had was Isaac. And as you wrapped up chapter 2, hopefully in your reading this past week, you read that Isaac eventually grew to be a man and took a wife named Rebekah. And they had 2 sons themselves, Jacob and Esau, with some really interesting family dynamics there. And this week we're going to move into the next generation in our story and take a look at Jacob's sons, the experience with Jacob's sons, and how God's plan continues to unfold through them. And it also gives us a really unique opportunity to gain some insight and understanding into this concept we've been talking about of the lower story, the details that we experience in day-to-day life, the highs and the lows, the times that we think life is great, and the times that we just wonder if we're going to survive the next day, let alone the next year. And we see in this story this coming to life in such a way, this interplay between the lower story and the upper story, that I think it will help us be able to translate that concept into our own lives and gain a little bit of understanding there. So the story that we take a look at today, chapter 3, brings us into the life of Jacob's son Joseph and his other sons as well. And it is a story that is maybe somewhat well known for those of you who are either theater fans or were perhaps growing up or young adults in the 70s. You perhaps remember that Andrew Lloyd Webber made a musical based on this story called Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. And this is, I made the comment to Michelle the other day, I said, so many people doubt the reality of the Bible, whether it's true or not, and I really don't understand why they do that, because when you look at the stories, the experiences that people had in biblical times, they are so sensational that even the most creative minds in Hollywood cannot make them up. And this is one of those stories. It is so out there, so unique from the human experience that even the most creative people really couldn't make this up and assemble the story in such a way that it fits the larger story of the Bible. So today we focus on Joseph. Joseph was the son of Jacob. In fact, he was the 11th son of Jacob. He had 10 older brothers. And Joseph was the favorite of his dad. His 10 older brothers really didn't like him because he was the favorite of dad. He was spoiled beyond belief. While the 10 older brothers were raised in kind of a typical fashion. They were well cared for, but they had plenty of chores to do around the house. They were expected to pull their own weight, to grow up and take on more responsibilities in the family farm, and that sort of thing. Joseph was just so favored by dad that he got to hang around the house and just have a life of leisure. Last night I made mention that whatever they had that was the equivalent of Xbox, he was probably sitting at home doing that. And Joseph, as a teenager, began having this recurring dream. And being a teenager, he couldn't manage to keep his mouth shut either. And he just had to go out and tell his brothers. And this dream was, hey, brothers who really don't like me because I'm spoiled by dad, get this. One day, you're going to bow down to me. Now, you can imagine when brothers are already really frustrated with Joseph because of the life he has and dad's favor he receives that they don't, that they're pretty upset when they hear this. Not a big fan of Joseph in that moment when he's out there saying, nanner, boo-boo, you are going to bow down to me one day. And Joseph, also, the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat portion of it, Joseph's favor from his dad was such that one day dad presents Joseph this gift of this colored coat, multicolored coat, which may not sound like a big deal to us today, but it was then because colored fabric was very, very expensive. This coat we understand, probably cost more than the collective wardrobes of all of his 10 older brothers put together. And Joseph gets this coat. And so Joseph, spoiled kid with a fancy coat, keeps running out to his brothers and saying, guys, you are going to bow down to me one day. Not scoring very many points on the list of popularity with his brothers. So as the story goes, as it unfolds, Joseph's older brothers were out tending the flocks. They're out away from the homestead, taking care of the flocks. And Joseph's dad, Jacob, says, hey, Joseph, I want you to go take some food to your brothers. Why don't you go out and take some food to them? So he slips on his fancy coat, and he grabs some food, and he heads out to find his brothers to provide them with food. And as he's journeying, his brothers can see him off in the distance with this red, sparkling coat. And they start to talk, and they say, look at that, Joseph. Here he comes in that fancy coat. Dad doesn't see anything wrong with him at all. Dad just goes on and on and on about how awesome he is. That kid has so much more than we ever will have. He has Dad's favor. He has Dad's respect. Dad spends all his money on him. I can't only imagine. This is going to get worse as he gets older. And then, can you believe it? He thinks that we're going to bow down to him one day. And so they devise this scheme, this plan, that they're going to kill Joseph just to solve this problem. They're going to get rid of him. And they're gonna go back to Dad and say, wow, we found Joseph's remains, an animal must have killed him. And as Joseph approaches, they get him in a pit. They couldn't necessarily just off him in a humane fashion, so to speak. But they put him in a pit, and they're about to leave him there to die, when a group of Ishmaelites come along. Now, if you remember from last week, we talked about the nation that came from Ishmael, Abraham's first son that he had with his wife's maidservant. And we talked about how God promised that a great nation would be made out of Ishmael, and that nation is the Arab nation. The Arab nation that still exists today was really founded by Ishmael, Abraham's first son, and that is the Muslim nation. So as they're out there, here comes some Ishmaelites, some Arabs, and they begin to think, brothers begin to think, and they say, well, all right, if we just let them die, we're not going to gain anything really from this, not right now anyway. We're going to deal with the pain of our brother, but that's about it. Or maybe we can sell them into slavery. They'll take care of our problem, and we'll get a few bucks out of the deal. We'll get some money out of the deal. So they sell Joseph into slavery to the Ishmaelites. The Ishmaelites leave with Joseph. The brothers come back for his home. Well, they have his fancy coat, and as they're figuring out how to handle this with Dad, they kill a goat and they dip Joseph's coat in goat's blood. And so they go home, and Dad can't believe what happened. Here's Joseph's coat. Apparently, he was attacked by some sort of beast. He's apparently dead. And Dad grieves for days. And those days turn into weeks, and those weeks turn into months. And the older brothers, surely begin to think, well, this didn't play out exactly like we thought. We hope that with Joseph gone, Dad would stop obsessing about him and would begin to pay some attention to us and develop this relationship with us, but he's not. He's even more obsessed about Joseph now than he was before. Everything that he does now is absolutely consumed with his memory of Joseph's loss. Joseph, in the meantime, is taken by these Ishmaelites, these Arabs, into Egypt, still an Arab nation today. He's taken into Egypt, and these slave traders sold him to Potiphar, who was the chief of the palace guard in Egypt. He was a very high-ranking official. And so Potiphar buys Joseph as a slave and puts him to work in his house in the city. And we read in the scripture that in slavery, God was with Joseph and he prospered. What could be terrible circumstances, God was with Joseph and he prospered. What that meant for Joseph was at Potiphar's house, he quickly gained the trust of Potiphar and the respect of Potiphar to the point that Scripture tells us that Potiphar entrusted all the affairs of his household and his work responsibilities to Joseph. Potiphar essentially went on vacation for a long while and let Joseph fill in his place. Joseph made all the decisions in the house, managed his finances, managed his servant staff. He also made decisions related to Potiphar's work responsibilities. And we see God's hand in that. God was with Joseph. Now, Scripture tells us, and this is the Scripture I identify with a great deal. When I share this, you'll understand why. Scripture tells us that Joseph, my sisters are starting to laugh, Joseph, much like me, was well-built and handsome. If you're not laughing, you're not paying attention, or you need to go to the eye doctor. One or the other. Anyway, Joseph was well-built and handsome. So much so that Potiphar's wife began to fancy him. She thought, wow, that's a good-looking guy. And he takes care of our house really well. This could get interesting. And boy, did it ever. Potiphar's wife sought to seduce Joseph. She wanted to get him in bed. And so she was after him. And Joseph finally says, look, you're married, not to me. You're married to my boss. I'm not going there. I'm not having any of that. And furthermore, for me to do this with you would be dishonoring to God. It's not going to happen. Well, she was relentless. And she continued her pursuit of Joseph. To the point that one day Joseph shows up for work. The house is empty. Potiphar's gone. The servants are gone. And he knew something was up. Boy finds Potiphar's wife, or perhaps more accurately, she finds him. And she makes one last-ditch effort to try to drag him into bed. He doesn't play along, and she seizes his cloak and basically, in today's terms, cries rape. She hollers, she screams because Joseph turned her down. And she tells a lie to her husband as he rushes in to see what's going on, what made his wife scream in that fashion. She says, "Hey, Joseph, your servant, he tried to take advantage of me. Look, I have his cloak as proof. I grabbed him, and this is the only thing I could get. I have his cloak as proof." Well, like any good husband, Potiphar is pretty upset about this, pretty angry. So he looks at this servant who had become a friend and the most trusted employee he'd ever had, and he doesn't see that anymore. He sees a slave who dishonored his house. And so the slave is sent off to prison. Not just any prison, but the king's prison, which was a particularly terrible place to be. He was with the worst of criminals, damp, dark, rodent-infested prison. And we read, God was with Joseph, and he prospered. Much like in Potiphar's house, Joseph is now in prison, and God was with him, and he prospered. And what that translated to in prison was he quickly earned the respect and trust of the warden, to the point that the warden, much like Potiphar, said, "Hey, Joseph, you know what? Yeah, you're in prison. You can't leave. But guess what? You get to run the place. I'm going on a coffee break for the next 3 months or 3 years or however long it takes." And so Joseph had the running of the prison. All the prison guards were his responsibility, and he had control of all the prisoners, and so on and so forth. God was with him, and he prospered. Now, while in prison, Joseph met a couple of guys, a couple of prisoners, who were having dreams that they couldn't make any sense of at all. And Scripture tells us that during this time in prison, God gave Joseph the ability to interpret dreams. So these guys, say, "Boy, we're having these dreams that really bother us. We can't make any sense out of them." And Joseph, through God through Joseph, probably a better way to say it, interpreted those dreams for those prisoners. And they were grateful. And Joseph said, just remember me. You don't owe me anything, just remember me. Now, as we read the story of Joseph, we see that these prisoners, these two prisoners in particular, are brought out of prison and brought into the service of the king. And they forgot that little detail of remembering Joseph. Until one day the king, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, had a dream, a troubling dream. This dream was that he saw the most healthy cow anybody had ever seen devour the most sickly-looking cow anyone had ever seen. And immediately after that, the most lush crops of grain, just beautiful crops of grain, laid waste to these very sparse, barren, diseased fields. And he couldn't make any sense of that. Pharaoh, being king of Egypt, had this whole realm of spiritual advisors and staff psychologists and that sort of thing. And so he calls them all in and says, "Hey, this is my dream that I just had, and this is very troubling to me. I need you to make some sense of it." And not one of them could. Now, as word traveled through Pharaoh's staff, these two prisoners all of a sudden remembered Joseph. They said, "Well, we know this guy. He's in your prison. He interpreted dreams for us. he might be able to help. So Pharaoh sends for Joseph. He has really no other hope at this point. So he sends for Joseph out of prison. And Joseph comes up, and Pharaoh says, well, I'm having this dream, and it's really bothering me. I know there's something significant about it, but I have no idea what it means. Can you interpret it? And Joseph says something that we would be wise to remember. Joseph says, I cannot, but God can. I cannot, but God can. Joseph understood that this was something much bigger than him, and that it was God working through him. And so he was granting credit where credit is due, as we say today. He was giving credit to God because he knew it was God that was doing it. He wasn't willing to take credit or responsibility for that himself. I cannot, but God can. So Pharaoh explains this dream to Joseph. He says, hey, I see this beautiful cow devouring this sickly cow, and I see the most beautiful fields I've ever seen before laying waste to these terrible, barren, diseased crops. What does it mean? Joseph says, I'll tell you what it means. It means that you are going to have, this land is going to have 7 years of plenty. Your herds are going to be more productive than they ever were before. Your fields, you're going to have bumper crops. It's going to be unlike anything you've ever experienced before. And then like that, you're going to go into famine. You're going to have 7 years of famine. You've been given this dream, Pharaoh, so that you can prepare. And so that this nation can survive. And Pharaoh, remembering Joseph's comment that it wasn't Joseph, but it was God, said, wow, God favors you this much? I want you to take responsibility for our nation during this time. To the point that Pharaoh said, I am only supreme to you in name. You have every decision-making authority that I do. You run the whole operation. And I'm going to sit back and watch because God has favor. It's not favoring. God is with you. And so Joseph, the prisoner, is now 39 years old. 17 from when he was sold into slavery at age 17. Now 39 years old. Finally out of prison. And he's essentially running the nation of Egypt. And sure enough, as Joseph predicted, there was 7 years of plenty, followed by famine. Famine hit the land in Egypt and beyond. We don't know, but some speculate perhaps the whole world, but certainly in that region of the world. Which brings us back to Joseph's brothers and his dad's household. So they were several miles away in the land of Canaan outside Jerusalem. And they were experiencing this famine as well. And finally things got bad enough for them that they were more or less without food. And Jacob, Dad, says, sons, I understand that there's food in Egypt. Why don't you see if you can go get us some food so we can survive? So the brothers get ready and they make this journey to Egypt. And they come into the place where the food is being distributed. And they walk in the door and Joseph's up there and he immediately recognizes his brothers. But they don't recognize him. For a few reasons, probably. I mean, remember, over 20 years had passed. We're getting close to 25 years from the last time they saw him. They had sold him into slavery, and if they hadn't presumed him dead, for sure they would have presumed him in bondage to someone somewhere not running Egypt. And also, we understand from a historical perspective that high-ranking authorities in Egypt at that point in time really were kind of decked out in makeup and fancy hairdo and wardrobe and that sort of thing. So even if they had suspected it, they might not have recognized it. Joseph, in this moment, is emotional, understandably so. He excuses himself for a couple minutes to kind of collect his thoughts, collect his emotions, and comes back as his brothers approach, seeking food. And they explain their family situation, hey, we're from over here in Canaan, and we are out of food, and we're hoping that you'll help us with some food. We really need it. We have our dad back home, and his household, and there's us, and we have another brother who's much younger than us, and so on. And Joseph says, well, I'll give you a little bit of food. But I'll tell you what, I want you to come back, and I want you to bring this younger brother. I need to meet him. I need to know him. But I want you to stay here tonight first. So they make preparations and stay the night, and at nightfall, Joseph commands some of his servants to go and pack his brother's caravan with food, but also to put silver in each of their bags. Morning comes, the brothers load up. Thank you, we'll be back, and they head for home. Now, as they make this journey home, they're trying to figure out what they're going to do, how they're going to explain all this to Dad. Well, they get there, and they open up their sacks, and Dad sees the money, and they're kind of confused by this, but Dad knew something was up. Wasn't quite sure what, but he knew something was up. But so anyway, they're faced with explaining to Dad that, hey, we have a little bit of food. This will last us for a while. But he told us that he'll give us more food, enough for us to get through, if we bring Benjamin with us. And Jacob says, I've already lost one son. I don't know that I can bear to lose another. If you take Benjamin and something happens to him, it will put me in the grave. Well, finally, one of the older brothers says, look, Dad, do we really have a choice? I mean, we need food. He has the food. He says bring Benjamin. I'll tell you what, Dad, I promise you, I will make sure that nothing bad happens to Benjamin. So Jacob relents, and now all of his 11 sons, that he's aware of anyway, head off for Egypt. They arrive in Egypt. They come in, and still they do not recognize the brother Joseph. Joseph sees them come in, sees Benjamin with them, and again is a little bit emotional. He steps off to the side, kind of collects his thoughts, his feelings, and he goes back in, and they say, well, we're here, and this is our baby brother Benjamin, our younger brother Benjamin, just like you asked. Now, can we have food? Joseph says, yes, you can have food. Just stay the night. You can head out in the morning. I'll have my men pack up your caravan. Plenty of food. So nightfall comes, and the brothers go to bed. And Joseph has his men pack up their caravan with lots of food. And more silver, including in Benjamin's sack, Joseph's royal cup. He hasn't put that in Benjamin's sack. So the brothers get up in the morning and they head out, back with Dad, to head back home. And pretty soon, Joseph's men come riding up. Wait a minute. There is something missing. We need to search your bags. And so they do, and as they open Benjamin's bag, here's Joseph's cup. And they essentially place Benjamin under arrest, saying, look, you stole from Joseph, our leader. I mean, he's second only to Pharaoh, the king, and you stole from him. So they all travel back into Egypt and face Joseph. And Joseph looks at the brothers and says, well, because he stole from me, he is now my slave for the rest of his life. He has to stay here, but the rest of you can go home. Now the older brothers are thinking, oh man, we promised Dad that nothing would happen to Benjamin. Now we're going to have to go back home without Benjamin. And so one of them appeals to Joseph and says, look, you don't understand. We have a brother who has lost his debt to Dad, and he's been grieving him for years. And he told us that if anything happened to Benjamin at all and we returned home without Benjamin, that would surely put him in the grave. Why don't you let me stay and serve in his place? Let Benjamin go free. I'll stay in his place. By now, things are coming to kind of an emotional high for Joseph. And so he asks his brothers to join him for dinner. He's trying to sort out exactly what to do. Looking at the brothers who sold him into slavery, the brothers who wished him dead, and them now, as his dream had come true, not his desire, but the dream that had been granted him had come true. His brothers were now bowing at his feet, as he was essentially royalty. If you have your book with you, your storybook with you, go ahead and turn to page 39. We're going to read a little bit of what happens as this comes to an emotionally charged head. You see what happens here uniquely. We're going to start at the second full paragraph on page 39. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, "Have everyone leave my presence." So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. He reveals his true identity to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. They were terrified because they knew what they deserved and they didn't know what was going to come next. And Joseph said to his brothers, "Come here, come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now, do not be distressed. Do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you." So in this moment, we have Joseph experiencing some of the craziness that happens in our lower story, right? You know, all the strange family dynamics. I mean, who can relate to having your siblings sell you into slavery? And Joseph is dealing with this. Now, over 20 years later, here's his brothers before him. And he's figuring out, sorting out how to reconcile with them. He's forgiven them, but they're not sure yet. They're fearful for their lives. And in that moment, Joseph reveals that he has insight into God's upper story. He understands clearly that God is up to something big. He says, "Look, don't be angry, don't be distressed, don't worry, don't be afraid, because it was to save lives that God sent me here. It wasn't exactly anything that you did, but this was part of God's plan, that I'm here." And he explains, "For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance." Joseph is explaining and has explained for them, and perhaps more importantly for us. He's saying that, hey, God sent me ahead for a reason, for a purpose, to preserve a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So what's Joseph talking about there? He sees God's plan at work in the midst of these crazy circumstances. He recognizes immediately that God is up to something big. We understand from history and anthropology that the Israelites, as God was establishing their nation in Canaan, they were shepherds. And we also understand that had they remained in Canaan during that period of time, they certainly would have intermarried them with people from other cultures in that area, therefore not preserving their ethnic heritage as God had intended in establishing His nation. But God knew what we know now, that the Egyptians viewed shepherds as something less than human. and therefore would not marry them. And so by having his nation develop over here in Egypt, where there wouldn't be intermarriage occurring, that they would be kept pure and have time to develop truly into a nation rather than just a handful of people. Remember, we had Abraham and Sarah, and then Isaac and Rebekah, and then Jacob and Esau, and now 12 sons. Not a very big nation, right? And so, the rest of Joseph's story, he says to his brothers, he says, hey, I want you to go get Dad in his household and move here. I'll make sure that you have property here to farm, and then you'll have everything that you need, and you'll thrive through this family, and you'll do well. And so the brothers go back to Dad, and Dad will never believe this, and quickly they pack up and move to make this journey as they begin to be established in Egypt. And we read in this story that Jacob, Dad, begins to grow old. And as he's facing the last days on earth, he calls for Joseph. He says, Joseph, I need you to promise me that when I die, you'll not bury me here, but you'll take me back home. You'll take me back to the land of Canaan and bury me there. And Joseph agrees to that. And when the day comes that Jacob dies, Pharaoh knows of this special relationship between Joseph and his family. And because Joseph is such a valued servant to Pharaoh, Pharaoh made provisions for Joseph to take troops with him for protection and men to help with this journey and making sure that Dad made it to his final burying place, his final resting place, and that Joseph returned safely. And so Jacob has essentially this royal funeral procession for Egypt came back home, back to Egypt. Now Jacob's gone, and his brothers still cannot believe this amazing forgiveness that they've been granted by Joseph. They're convinced, or at least concerned, that now that Dad's gone, Joseph is going to take his revenge on him. But he doesn't. They come to him and say, Joseph, we're worried about this. And Joseph said, what is probably one of the better known Bible verses, or certainly Old Testament verses. Joseph looks at them and says, don't worry. What you intended for evil, God intended for good. What you intended for evil, God intended for good. So how does that fit us today, aside from being a really great story? How does that fit us today? Now we need to understand that Joseph was sold into slavery at age 17. He was brought out of prison and given essentially governorship of Egypt at age 39. 22 years of difficulty and struggle and trial. 22 years of some pretty terrible circumstances in his life before God's plan begins to unfold. Now after that, Joseph had 71 years of a blessed life as he lived essentially as royalty. He prospered. Life was pretty darn good for him. But when we're in the midst of our lower story and the junk of trying to figure out what's going on and trying to figure out up from down and why is life crazy, why does it have to be this difficult, why am I facing this particular challenge, we should be considering God's upper story and what's at work. And we should remember that, hey, we look at Joseph, he had 22 years of this before he understood God's big story, God's upper story, before that turn occurred. Now, most of us probably don't experience 22 years of struggle. And we should be thankful for that. We should look at the story of Joseph and give praise to God that maybe our struggle is 22 hours or 22 days, or a really long one, maybe 22 months. But not 22 years. We also should be looking at the midst of the details of our lives and looking for God being at work, because He for sure is using our circumstances, our struggles, our challenges, our successes as well in accomplishing His purposes. Having the knowledge that God's story is unfolding and even the most bleak, most difficult, most confusing times should be a source of great peace for us, to allow us to make it through, to allow us and to help us to forgive those who have sinned against us. See, God tests us in order that our faith is built in Him, that our trust is built in Him, and that our character is made more in His image, drawing us back into that perfect relationship with Him. So as you proceed into chapter 3 of the story this week, as you progress into that, I would urge you, as you read that, to take time and seriously think about the struggles, the circumstances, whatever is going on or has been going on recently in your little story. And really try to search out what God may be up to. What the upper story is. What the upper story perspective is in the midst of your circumstances. So that's week 3. Away we go.